Hey guys, welcome to this week of Outside the Circle. This is the last true week of storytelling, as next week we're going to do things a little different by looking at some of the Psalms of David. So this is the last week of true story as far as the story and life of David. So last week, things got a little bit scandalous. And sadly, this week isn't much different. David has some very turbulent final years with some good, but some not so good, kind of some down periods as well. But the legacy he will leave, not only for Israel, but really for the world and honestly for all eternity, is something that really kind of needs to be discussed to an extent. So this week, we'll be looking, or we're going to kind of go into the future a little bit from where we were last week. We are covering the periods from 2 Samuel 13 to 1 Kings 2. Don't worry, guys. We're not going through every detail of that. There are some key points though I definitely want us to look at to really understand the final years of David. So the first one actually is right in chapter 13. So picking right up where we left off. I say right where we left off again. There are some years between chapter 12 and 13. But as far as chapter wise, it's the same thing. So I'm going to kind of summarize a lot of this. There is some good reading there. I highly recommend kind of just trying to read it in your own time if you get a chance, just to really get into the meat and the juicy details and stuff like that. But I'm going to kind of just skim through and point out a few big moments. So the story we're about to come upon actually deals with some of David's kids. Again, he had many wives and things like that, so he had a good bit of kids. And so with those kids, though, he has, there's many wives for the many kids he has, and obviously not all of them share the same mommy. And so that's kind of what we're going to look at, because we're going to focus on 3 kids in particular. With one of the wives, he had a son named Amnon. But then with another wife, he had a son and a daughter named Absalom and Tamar. And that's kind of where the fun kind of picks in. It gets really interesting. So, to kind of sugarcoat it, not sugarcoat it, Amnon actually falls in love, so to say, with his half-sister Tamar. I know, kind of weird. But he does something really sneaky to kind of get her in the room alone. And so when she's in there, he kind of makes this move on her to try to have her... let's just put it this way. He makes a move. Tamar asks him not to disgrace her, but Amnon doesn't really listen. So, you can kind of put 2 and 2 together. So to not make this really rated R, we'll just say that he was intimate with her without her consent. So yeah, kind of a big no-no there. So what makes it worse is when you read what happens right after this incident. If you pick up in chapter 13, verse 15 of 2 Samuel, it says, "So Amnon hated Tamar with such intensity that the hatred he hated her with was greater than the love he had loved her with." And so it seems really weird because, again, we just went from where it said, a couple verses back, it's like, oh, he loved her so much, that's why he concocted this whole scheme to get with her and to be with her. But now all of a sudden he's enraged with Tamar. And what that really tells us is he was never actually in love with Tamar. He was just lusting after her. And once he kind of got it, he wasn't as, fulfilled, I guess, by it, so to say. So, like father, like son a little bit, sees a woman, thinks she's beautiful, kind of lusts after her and desires her. So, kind of sounds a lot like David from last week. So, sadly, that's part of his legacy is his kids kind of take after that a little bit. But once Amnon got her, he was done with it. Again, he lusted after her, not loved her. But, she was still disgraced by these actions because obviously he still did things to her. And when her full-blooded brother, Absalom, hears of this, he actually becomes very enraged against Amnon. And so we actually see what Absalom's response to that is if you skip down to verse 20. It says, her brother Absalom said to her, has your brother Amnon been with you? Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart. So Tamar lived as a desolate woman in the house of her brother Absalom. So it seems kind of weird when you dig into it. I mean, he literally says, remain quiet, you know, and by doing so, really what it's kind of saying is, hey, can you just sit still, be quiet until I can figure out what to do, basically. Like, he wants to deal with it. He feels like he needs to deal with it, especially as her brother. Like, I need to figure this out, but that is also our brother. Like, you know, we kind of have to be tact with this. So, you know, he's kind of just like, hey, remain quiet, I'll figure it out. Well, this boy takes almost 2 years to figure something out. Like, 2 years go by, it's all a mess. So, but similar to Amnon, Absalom's pretty tricky and crafty as well. And so he ends up finding a way to, basically, long roundabout way, he actually has his own men murder Amnon. Once again, like father, like son. Hey, I have these guys that I can tell what to do, and they can make it look like this man was just murdered in a fight, you know, not, or killed in a fight, so to say, not, you know, murdered by someone within his own house. So, again, David's legacy from last week, we've already seen two of his sons enact very similar things that David did. So, but when word gets back about this to David, he becomes very furious. So Absalom flees from David out of fear, rightfully so. I mean, David was burning hot. And he stays gone for a while. But check out verse 39 of chapter 13. It says, King David longed to go to Absalom, for David had finished grieving over Amnon's death. So again, this is a little while later. Again, Absalom flees, but this time apart, once David works through dealing with the loss of Amnon, he really wants Absalom to come back home. You know, it's bad enough he already lost one son out of, you know, being murdered, but, you know, he's got another son on the run. He wants him to come back home. And so David sends Joab, our friendly, trusty Joab, who's been around with David for a while now. So he sends Joab to go out and get him. But there is a condition. And if you go to chapter 14, verse 23, we actually see what this condition is. It says, so Joab got up, went to Geshur, which is where Absalom was, and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. However, the king added, he may return to his house, but he may not see my face. So Absalom returned to his house, but he did not see the king. So David allows Absalom to come home, but he keeps a distance between him. And, you know, this leads to a growing tension between the two. Obviously, there was already kind of a rift there because of what Absalom did by murdering Amnon. But even when it kind of feels like maybe there's a way that, you know, they can work through this, maybe like, oh, hey, my dad wants me home, maybe we can start mending this relationship. And it's kind of like, hey, you can come home, but you don't really get to see me or my face and stuff like that. And so it's like, hey, you're home, but you're still away from me. You know, I'm still keeping you at arm's length. And so, you know, this turns into an issue. And over time, this resentment grows to the point that Absalom actually leads a revolt against David. And over a course of time, Absalom actually gets the upper hand and actually ends up sending David on the run. So once again, David is fleeing and on the run. Seems to be a common theme here. Sadly, this time by his own son, you know. And so a new civil war begins in Israel. And it does last for a while, a couple years. But eventually David, through being just a wise general and things like that, and having this wartime experience and stuff, he eventually gets the upper hand and defeats Absalom. But during this time, though, we see what becomes of Absalom during this defeat. We have to go over to chapter 18, starting in verse 9. It says, Absalom was riding on his mule when he happened to meet David's soldiers. When the mule went under the tangled branches of the large oak tree, Absalom's head was caught fast in the trees. The mule under him kept going, so he was suspended in mid-air. And so then some of these men find him, just kind of paraphrasing what happens next. Some of these men find him, as far as David's men, and they decide to kind of take care of it. If you go down to 14, we see what comes of this. It says, Joab said, I'm not going to waste time with you. He then took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them into Absalom's chest, while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. 10 young men who were Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. So sadly, that's the end of Absalom. So now you have 2 of David's sons, in essence, brutally murdered. Absalom, I mean, both of them, in a way, kind of had it coming. But what's sad is the way they had it coming was by doing what their dad did. You know, Absalom lusted after a woman and decided to take her for his own. And, I mean, that's what David did. Like, yeah, it wasn't David's half-sister, but it still wasn't his to take. As far as, obviously, Bathsheba was with Uriah, and yet here goes Amnon saying, hey, that woman looks nice. I don't care that she's my half-sister. I'm just going to do it anyways. So, again, taking what's not yours. Very much what David did. And then now you have Absalom, who, in a roundabout way, you know, does the same as David of sending someone out to be murdered. Again, in this case, it was his own brother. But this is what we kind of see. And there's many more examples going down the road for just the house of David after this that we're not going to get into today. But this goes back to kind of what we talked about last week as part of the punishment for David, where it says that, you know, the sword will never leave your household. This is what it's referring to, that violence will just be a thing. And if you read through the book of First Kings and Second Kings and other things like that, like, you see this repeated factor of, you know, violence and war and things like that, that come from, you know, bad decisions that were made. And so, you know, both of them did stuff similar to their daddy, which ends up costing them their life, because obviously because of Amnon, I mean, it's all correlated. Of Amnon, you know, does what he does to Tamar, Absalom becomes upset, and, you know, he basically murders Amnon. And with Amnon being killed, David's upset with Absalom. So then there's the growing tension there, which leads to the revolt by Absalom. And so now there's this, you know, feud going on, which ultimately leads to this war that puts Absalom in this position. And Joab, who is loyal to David, is like, yo, we're going to kill you now, you know? So what's sad is David's sons are killed for doing exactly what David did, but just being on the wrong side of it in this case. And so, you know, now David has lost 3 sons when you include the one that was lost from the adulterous relationship that he had with Bathsheba, the baby that was, you know, to be born to them that died, that we talked about last week, as punishment for said sin. And now you have Amnon and Absalom. So David's lost a lot. So if we look at verse 33, we actually kind of see how he responds to this. In chapter 18 still, verse 33. The king was deeply moved and went up to his chamber above the city gate and wept. As he walked, he cried, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I had died instead of you, Absalom, my son, my son. So once again, David is just very grieved by the loss of his son. We've seen kind of how he's done some of these others. But it is interesting when you look back how he responded when he lost a child from his affair with Bathsheba. Of, it's, again, he sinned, he lost a child, and he moved on with his day. But here he's still grieving because it's not directly his fault in the sense of he did stuff, but it's like because of his actions and not addressing his own demons in a way, his kids repeated these mistakes, and therefore, you know, it becomes a problem. And so, but in good news for David, the kingdom is restored. Again, not a full civil war, but a mild civil war going on again between David and Absalom. So now with Absalom out of the way, David once again fully king of Israel. Um, united under David once again, and life goes pretty smoothly again for a while. There's some minor things here and there that are kind of neat. Again, recommend you trying to read it if you ever get a chance. There's some fun stuff, but for the most part, David lives out his days with ease until he goes to die. And the end of 2 Samuel as a book actually gives us two insightful discourses from David. One of them is in 2 Samuel 22. It's a song of thanksgiving from David after being rescued from Saul back in the day. So, again, these aren't really written in order as far as this spot. These could have been, this little Thanksgiving letter could have been written a lot earlier, or it could have been David reflecting late in life and deciding to write it. But again, it's a thanks to God for always keeping him safe and rescuing him from Saul, which is kind of neat because when you look at, I will say this, I'm not gonna read it, but I do recommend reading it and then going back to 1 Samuel, like we talked about Samuel's mom Hannah, way back like week 1 we talked about this, that Hannah had prayed for a long time for a son from God. And when you look at some of her writing and some of her letters up front, as I say letters, but her songs, especially once she was able to conceive, you kind of see this parallel with David that kind of bookends the two, like 1 and 2 Samuel together, which I think is really cool. That even though they're two different people, you see similar expressions of gratitude and praise towards God for delivering them in their time of need or delivering them from whatever. With Hannah, it was her barrenness. For David, it was Saul. And so it's kind of just cool that you get this kind of beginning of 1 Samuel, end of 2 Samuel. You get these kind of similar passages. So it's cool. Recommend reading it in your own time and just taking some time to do that because it is really neat. But I do want to focus on chapter 23 of 2 Samuel. Because and it's a little shorter, which is kind of why I chose to do it instead of the longer Thanksgiving. But I think it's really cool because the section is titled David's Last Words. And so something he kind of writes down. So I just kind of wanted to read it. So starting in verse 1, it says, "These are the last words of David, the declaration of David, son of Jesse, the declaration of a man raised on high, the one anointed by God of Jacob, or the God of Jacob, sorry. This is the most delightful of Israel's songs. The Spirit of the Lord spoke through me. His words was on my tongue. The God of Israel spoke. The Rock of Israel said to me, the one who rules the people with justice, who rules in the fear of God, is like the morning light when the sun rises, on a cloudless morning, the glisten of rain on sprouting grass. It is not true my house is with God, for he has established a permanent covenant with me, ordered and secured in every detail. Will he not bring about my whole salvation and my every desire? But all the wicked are like thorns raked aside. They can never be picked up by hand. The man who touches them must be armed with iron and the shaft of a spear. They will be completely burned up on the spot." So those are the official last words of David. We will see there's actually some other words he says, but this seems to be like a final official statement of King David, so to say, not just David the man, so to say. And so there's really interesting things to notice here about David's thoughts and his heart with his life and his relationship with God. Some great insight to David as he reflects on things as a man who's kind of coming towards the end of his life, and so he's just really reflective, really thinking on things. And so it's really cool to see some of the things he discusses there. I really suggest you kind of just maybe go back and read it, kind of break it apart, especially looking back at what we've talked about over the last couple of weeks and seeing kind of how some of this correlates with that. I would spend more time, but kind of want to keep trekking forward because there's a few other things I want to want to really touch on as we talk about his legacy. And obviously, I don't want to keep you guys for like 5 hours. So, but again, I one of the many things I recommend trying to kind of read. I know I've thrown a few things out there, but hey, you can never say you don't have sections to read for your Bible study because I'm giving you plenty of content to read here. So, but anyway, so again, David's reflecting on his life. I think this is kind of more of his official last statement that he wants people to remember as he moves on. You can tell a lot by someone with their last words, and this definitely seems like a man who understands his time is coming to an end. And so, and really, when you finish off the book and you move into First Kings, we actually kind of see this as well of David really having that sense of, hey, it's almost time. Like my days are almost up. And so, with that being said, with David coming to a close comes a vacuum that kind of has to be filled, right? Power doesn't just cease; it just passes on to a new owner and things like that. And so, David, again, having many wives, had many children, and one of said children is a son that he has named Adonijah, and Adonijah seeks to take the throne. And due to the whole Joab incident with Absalom, Joab and David aren't exactly on the greatest terms. And so Joab goes full force into saying, you know what, Adonijah should be king. But Bathsheba and honestly Nathan both are like, no, Solomon's meant to be king, especially Nathan coming from the side of God. So being the prophet, he's very much like, well, I know God wants Solomon to be king, with the whole Davidic covenant of, God saying like your child would be there, and we see that child of promise is Solomon. Obviously, again, the Davidic covenant has a larger implication, but the direct correlation right at that moment was Solomon. And so Nathan and Bathsheba kind of put their full support onto Solomon being on the throne. And over a course of time, we see different moments, but ultimately David chooses Solomon to be the next king. And so he puts his full support behind Solomon. Again, David would have known that Solomon was the promised king from God, as we saw with, again, the Davidic covenant that we talked about a couple weeks ago. And so we actually see in 1 Kings chapter 2, starting in verse 1, that David gives Solomon some words of wisdom, which is kind of cool. And so starting in verse 1 of chapter 2 of 1 Kings, it says, as the time approached for David to die, he ordered his son Solomon, as for me, I am going the way of all of the earth. Be strong and be a man, and keep your obligations to the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his stature, commands, ordinances, and decrees. This is written in the law of Moses, so that you will have success in everything you do, and wherever you turn, and so that the Lord will fulfill his promise that he made to me. If your son guards their way to walk faithfully before me with all their heart and with all their soul, you will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. So David passes the throne on to Solomon with some really great words of wisdom. Again, David understands the Davidic covenant and basically passed that on to Solomon, saying, look, this is what God told me. If we, follow him, if we stick to him, if we obey his commands, then basically our line will be successful and will sit on the throne of Israel. And sadly, if you go down a couple more verses, we actually get to David's end, starting in verse 10. It says, then David rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. Hint, hint for all you Luke lovers who read the Christmas story every year. The length of time David reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his kingship was firmly established. And so with that, the great epic story of David has come to a close. A young shepherd boy who became a giant killer and then a great king of Israel, leaving behind an incredible legacy, really. And sadly, that is both good and bad when referencing David. Because legacy isn't necessarily just what you do, it's what you leave behind after. In this case, obviously, children are a great example of the kind of legacy you leave and how you raise them and how they kind of turn out to an extent. But sadly, in the case of Amnon and Absalom and Adonijah, the A names apparently had problems, but hey, the S name with Solomon apparently seemed to be okay. But yeah, sadly with Amnon, Absalom, and Adonijah, they took some of the bad stuff from their father's legacy, as we've discussed. And so, it's one of those things that sadly, if you don't deal with things, often your children will have to. That's kind of how generational trauma kind of starts, is one generation doesn't deal with it and it just gets passed on to the next and to the next and to the next until somebody finally breaks the chain. And sadly, they are the proof of that. But there are some good parts as well. Again, you look at Solomon. Solomon's a wise king. He eventually becomes the wisest man of all time, thanks to God who gives him that. And so when asked by God, when God asked Solomon, basically what would you want? And Solomon asked for wisdom, and so he literally becomes the wisest man of all time through that. Great story if you ever get into Solomon. We're not going to get into it because we kind of focus more on David, but what's really cool with Solomon is actually he goes on to build the temple that David desperately wanted to build. David got all the materials and everything to set it up and build one. He even had the place picked out. It was ready to go for someone to hit the ground running, and Solomon ends up being the one to build it. And what's really cool about that is that it's the exact same temple that Jesus actually visits when we get into the Gospels. The one that when Jesus makes the comment of tear the temple down in 3 days, I'll rebuild it. And they're sitting there like, bro, that's not true. Well, I say it's the same temple. Technically, the temple was destroyed. They rebuilt it. So not the exact same temple, but practically the same temple. It's the same location. It's the same. They do rebuild it later. That's a whole nother story if you get into the Minor Prophets. But actually, really, the end of the Kings, I think, is where you see that. I could be wrong. You can fact check me on that. But bottom line, sadly, Solomon's temple does get destroyed later, and then it is rebuilt. It takes about 40 years. Again, Minor Prophets kind of get into the rebuild. I want to say it's Nehemiah that really discusses the rebuild of the temple, but I digress. All this to say, though, the temple that Solomon builds is the precursor to the one that Jesus would eventually go to. And so, it's so cool to see how David set all that in motion. And, he built something for the future. And so, when discussing David's legacy, it can be a bit complicated. He has some amazing heights with being a giant slayer and doing great things for Israel. But he also has some rough lows with Bathsheba and how his children kind of turned down some of the issues they had because he didn't deal with them. But through all of it, he was still a man after God's own heart. Because no matter what, he kept his eyes on God. And when he didn't, such as with David with Bathsheba, he repented. He got back in line with God, like we discussed last week. And this helped lead him, this helped lead him to being one of Israel's greatest leaders and kings, to the point that it put Nazareth on the map as the city of David. Like I said just a little while ago, if you go to the book of Luke, it literally talks about, today in the city of David. Like, they didn't even call it Nazareth. I say Nazareth. They didn't call it Bethlehem. Nazareth, Bethlehem, two different places. Sorry. They put Bethlehem on the map. It literally talks about the city of David. Like, everyone just knew it. Like, you say city of David, oh, Bethlehem. Like, I know it. Like, that's how instinctual, as far as, like, the names being together. And so, again, if you read the Christmas story at Christmas time, you hear it all the time, city of David. Because that's where David's from, and ultimately that's where Jesus would come from. Of course, Jesus being the true fulfillment of the Davidic covenant of that God would establish a permanent kingdom from David's line, which would be Jesus. And you see this if you actually go to Matthew chapter 1 with the genealogy of Christ. David is listed as an ancestor to Jesus. Even Bathsheba was. It's listed there. And so this kingdom that God tells David that he is going to establish through David's line, is fulfilled in Jesus, and what's really cool about that, though, is it's not just like, oh, hey, that's a thing, but Jesus kind of honors that, and Jesus actually, I don't know the best phrasing here, but like, he really just, let me just get into it, because it's better if I just show you. So if you go to Revelation chapter 22, which is the last chapter of the book, literally the last book of the Bible, this is literally like 5 verses from the end of the Bible. So you already go through all of Revelation and end time. You get to casting out Satan and all that. You get to the new creation, the new Jerusalem, the new heavens and earth, all this. And you get into what's known as the eternal state, where believers will be with God forever in the new heavens and earth and stuff like that. And during this, you have this little ending part that's kind of like the last call to action of Scripture. It even talk, like it says, I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things, talking about he recorded this as God told him to. But I want you to look down in chapter 22 at verse 16. It says, I, Jesus, have sent my angel to attest these things for you, for the churches. Because again, all of, if you don't know, all of Revelation originally was sent to 7 churches that Jesus discusses in like chapters 3 and 4. And there's different churches in the area that Jesus is directly referencing to things then. But within this letter, he adds in end time stuff and what to look for and to be alert and be ready. So again, I, Jesus, have sent my angels to attest these things to you for the churches. I am the root and descendant of David, the bright morning star. And so at the end of all of it, again, this is 5 verses from the very end of the Bible. Jesus claims David as his ancestor. Doesn't really get any bigger than that the Son of God says, I am from the root of David. That the covenant that God made with David was fulfilled through me. And even at the end of time, the permanent kingdom that God promised David is here and fulfilled through me. And that's just God coming through on his promise to David. And that's just crazy to think about. And so when looking at David's legacy, I think the biggest thing you draw is that it all started with a simple shepherd boy with a sling and a stone, but the heart of a lion that just challenged him to go and do the impossible, to a God that's the God who's known for the impossible. And that, to me, is why David is a man after God's own heart. And that's the legacy that he leaves behind. Thanks for joining, guys. See you next week.